Jenna slammed the brakes so hard her heart felt like it might jump out of her chest. The car skidded slightly on the rain-slicked road, tires squealing as she threw it into park. Her hands shook as she flung the door open, the cold night air biting at her face. There, in the glow of her headlights, was a tiny bundle of fur, unmoving, right in the middle of the street. For a moment, she couldn't even breathe. Had she hit it? No, she was sure she hadn't. The puppy had been lying there when she spotted it, barely visible against the wet pavement. She dashed forward, her pulse pounding in her ears as she knelt beside the little creature. It was breathing. Just barely, a shiver ran through its fragile body, its soaked fur clinging to thin ribs. Jenna's throat tightened as she reached out, afraid to touch it, but knowing she had to. When her fingers brushed its tiny paw, a whimper escaped its lips. "You're okay?" she whispered, even though she wasn't sure that was true. "I've got you." Gently, she scooped the puppy up, cradling it against her chest. Its body was alarmingly light, ribs poking through the damp fur. As she held it closer, she realized something was very wrong. Blood smeared her hands, fresh and warm. It wasn't coming from its side or back. It was coming from its paws. "Oh no," she gasped, rushing back to her car. She settled the puppy on the passenger seat, its tiny frame curling into itself. Reaching into her glove compartment, she grabbed the old towel she kept there and wrapped it as gently as she could around its trembling body. The poor thing barely had the strength to move, its little eyes fluttering open for only a second before closing again. Her mind raced. The nearest vet clinic was 20 minutes away, but she had no choice. She turned the key, her car roaring back to life as she sped toward town, checking on the puppy every few seconds. "Stay with me, little one," she murmured, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The clinic's parking lot was empty when she pulled in, the bright red "open" sign flickering in the window. Jenna barely had the car in park before she was out, cradling the tiny dog against her chest as she burst through the front doors. Dr. Miller looked up from behind the desk, his expression shifting from surprise to concern in an instant. "What happened?" he asked, already moving toward her. I found him in the middle of the road," Jenna said breathlessly. "He's hurt. His paws, there's so much blood. Come with me." Dr. Miller didn't waste a second. He led her into the exam room, flipping on the bright overhead light as he gestured for her to set the puppy down on the table. Jenna hesitated. The little one had stopped whimpering, but she wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a very bad one. "He's alive," Dr. Miller reassured her, as if sensing her thoughts. "But we need to act fast." Jenna finally placed the puppy down, stepping back as the vet began his examination. He ran a gentle hand over its tiny body, checking for any other injuries before focusing on its paws. The moment he lifted one of them, he sucked in a sharp breath. Jenna's stomach dropped. "What? What is it?" Dr. Miller didn't answer right away. Instead, he grabbed a pair of gloves and carefully wiped away the blood. What lay underneath made his jaw tighten. "These wounds aren't from the road," he said grimly. "Someone did this to him." Jenna felt like the room had suddenly turned upside down. "What?" she choked out. "These cuts," Dr. Miller continued, his voice steady but serious, "are clean. Too clean. And deep. Like someone took something sharp to his paws." Jenna's hands clenched into fists. The thought of someone deliberately hurting this defenseless creature made her stomach churn. She forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to push past the anger rising inside her. "Can you help him?" Dr. Miller nodded. "We'll do everything we can. He's weak, but he's a fighter. We need to clean these wounds and get him stabilized. I'll need to keep him here for a while." Jenna's heart twisted. The idea of leaving the little one behind, even in the capable hands of the vet, felt unbearable. But she knew it was the only option. "Okay," she said quietly. "Do whatever it takes." Dr. Miller gave her a reassuring nod before turning to his assistant. "Let's get him on fluids and start cleaning the wounds." Jenna stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself as she watched them work. The puppy didn't move much, but every now and then his tiny body twitched. He was still fighting. She didn't know where he had come from, who had hurt him, or why, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't leaving him alone. Not now. Not ever. Jenna could barely sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the tiny, trembling puppy lying on that cold, wet pavement, bleeding, helpless, barely clinging to life. The thought of someone deliberately harming such a defenseless creature filled her with a deep, burning anger that refused to settle. She had never considered herself an emotional person, but this was different. This wasn't just anger. This was heartbreak wrapped in fury. By the time the sun rose, Jenna was already dressed and out the door, her car keys in hand. She barely remembered the drive to the clinic, her thoughts racing as she pulled into the parking lot. The vet's office wasn't officially open yet, but she could see a light on inside. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of her car and knocked softly on the door. Dr. Miller answered almost immediately. He looked tired, but the small smile on his face was enough to ease some of Jenna's nerves. "You're here early." "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "How is he?" Dr. Miller stepped aside, letting her in. "Come see for yourself." Her heart pounded as she followed him down the hallway to the back room. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, but there was a warmth in the space that put her slightly at ease. The little puppy was curled up in a soft blanket inside a small kennel, his tiny body rising and falling with steady breaths. An IV was attached to his paw, and his bandaged feet rested against the plush bedding. "He made it through the night," Dr. Miller said. "He's not out of the woods yet, but he's stronger than I expected." Jenna exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Can I hold him?" Dr. Miller nodded. "Carefully. He's still very sore." She reached in, gently lifting the tiny puppy into her arms. His fur was soft beneath her fingertips, his body warm against her chest. He let out a small sigh, nuzzling into her as if recognizing her presence. Something in Jenna's heart shifted at that moment. She had found him broken, abandoned, barely hanging on, but he was still fighting, and she wasn't going to let him do it alone. "Has anyone come forward?" she asked. "Anyone looking for him?" Dr. Miller shook his head. "No, and I don't think anyone will. Given his condition, I don't believe he was lost. I believe someone left him there." Jenna swallowed hard. "Then I want to take care of him. When he's ready to leave, I want him to come home with me." Dr. Miller studied her for a long moment before nodding. "That's a big responsibility, Jenna. He's going to need a lot of care. His paws will take time to heal, and even after that, he might have trouble walking normally." "I don't care," she said, determination clear in her voice. "I'll do whatever it takes." Dr. Miller smiled. "Then let's get him better first." Jenna spent the next few days visiting the puppy every morning before work and every evening before heading home. She would sit with him, talking to him in soft tones, gently stroking his fur. She named him Lucky, a name that felt both ironic and hopeful. He had survived something terrible, but he had been given a second chance. And she was going to make sure he knew nothing but love from now on. Day by day, Lucky grew stronger. He started to wag his tiny tail when Jenna walked into the room. He perked up when she spoke, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice. His eyes, once dull and filled with pain, began to shine with curiosity. The first time he licked her fingers, her heart nearly burst. "He's going to be okay," Dr. Miller told her on the 5th day. "It'll take time, but he's healing well. I think he's ready to go home with you." Jenna had been waiting for those words, but hearing them still sent a rush of emotions through her. She carefully bundled Lucky in a soft blanket and carried him to her car, setting him on the passenger seat. "Ready to go home, little guy?" she whispered. Lucky blinked up at her sleepily, his tiny tail giving the smallest wag. The drive home felt surreal. When she pulled into her driveway, she hesitated for a moment before stepping out, cradling Lucky in her arms as she carried him inside. She had already prepared everything: a soft bed, food, water, toys. She set him down gently, watching as he sniffed the blanket she had laid out for him. At first, he just sat there, as if unsure of what to do. Then, slowly, he stretched out and rested his head against the plush fabric, letting out a soft sigh. Jenna knelt beside him, running her fingers through his fur. "You're safe now," she murmured. "No one is ever going to hurt you again." Lucky's little tail gave another wag, and for the first time since she had found him, Jenna allowed herself to believe that everything was going to be okay. The first few nights with Lucky were rough. Jenna had expected that, but knowing it in her head didn't make it any easier in practice. He whimpered in his sleep, sometimes letting out tiny yelps that made her heart ache. She would wake up at the slightest sound, rushing to his bed to make sure he was okay. He would blink up at her with sleepy eyes, sometimes nuzzling into her hand as she whispered soft reassurances. More than once, she ended up sleeping on the floor beside him, just so he wouldn't feel alone. During the day, she carefully carried him outside to a small patch of grass in her yard, letting him get some fresh air. His paws were still bandaged, and she was cautious not to let him put too much weight on them. At first, he barely moved, his tiny body exhausted from the trauma he had endured. But slowly, over the course of the next week, she saw the signs of progress. He started sitting up more on his own. His tail, which had once barely moved, began to give little wags whenever he saw her. His appetite improved, and Jenna celebrated the first time he finished an entire bowl of food with a proud smile. "That's my strong boy," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. Lucky leaned into her touch, letting out a soft sigh of contentment. She worked from home as much as she could, unwilling to leave him alone for too long. When she did have to go out, she set up a little space for him in the living room, surrounding him with blankets and a few soft toys. She would check on him through a small camera she had set up, watching as he dozed peacefully or lazily nibbled at his chew toy. It reassured her to know that he was settling in, that he felt safe. By the end of the second week, Lucky attempted his first real steps. Jenna had taken him outside again, the morning sun casting a golden glow over the yard. He sat beside her on the grass, his little body relaxed in the warmth of the sunlight. Then, slowly, he pushed himself up onto his front legs, his hind legs trembling slightly as he tried to follow. Jenna held her breath, watching as he hesitated for a moment before taking a small, unsteady step forward. "Lucky!" she gasped, her eyes wide with excitement. "You did it!" He wobbled slightly, his bandaged paws making it difficult to balance, but he managed another step. Jenna reached out, steadying him as he made his way toward her, his tail wagging ever so slightly. She scooped him up, pressing a gentle kiss to his head. "I'm so proud of you." The improvement gave her hope. Every day, he seemed a little stronger, a little more confident. But there were still shadows in his past that clung to him. He startled easily, flinching at sudden movements or loud noises. One night, when a thunderstorm rolled through town, he cowered in the corner of the room, shaking so violently that Jenna thought he might make himself sick. She scooped him into her arms, wrapping a blanket around him as she murmured soothing words, rocking him gently like a baby. "It's okay, love," she whispered. "You're safe. Nothing's going to hurt you here." It took nearly an hour for him to calm down, his little body finally relaxing against her chest as the storm raged outside. Jenna's mind spun as she held him, wondering what kind of life he had before she found him. Had he been left outside in storms before? Had he been forced to fend for himself against the elements? The thought of it made her sick, but she forced herself to focus on the present. He was here now. He was safe. And she would make sure he never felt that kind of fear again. As the days turned into weeks, Lucky's personality began to shine through. He was playful in a way that made Jenna laugh, batting at her fingers with his tiny paws, pouncing on his toys with surprising enthusiasm. He would follow her around the house, his little feet tapping against the floor as he tried to keep up. At night, he no longer whimpered in his sleep. Instead, he would curl up at the foot of her bed, letting out soft, contented sighs as he drifted off. One evening, as Jenna sat on the couch, reading, Lucky hopped up beside her, nudging her hand with his nose. She looked down at him, smiling as she set her book aside. "What is it, buddy?" He let out a small, happy bark before climbing into her lap, curling into a tight little ball. Jenna chuckled, running a hand over his soft fur. "You're really starting to feel at home, huh?" His only response was a sleepy sigh. She stared down at him, warmth spreading through her chest. She had never intended to adopt a dog. She had never even considered it. But now, she couldn't imagine her life without him. Then, just as things were settling into a routine, something happened that reminded her just how fragile Lucky's progress still was. She had taken him to the vet for a checkup, excited to hear Dr. Miller's thoughts on how well he was healing. They were in the waiting room when the front door swung open, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a roughness to his features that made Jenna tense instinctively. Lucky, who had been sitting quietly at her feet, suddenly shrank back, pressing himself against her leg. His tail, which had been wagging only moments before, tucked between his legs as he let out a low, fearful whimper. Jenna frowned, glancing down at him. "Hey, it's okay," she murmured, reaching down to stroke his back. But Lucky was shaking, his wide eyes locked on the man who had just entered. The man paid no attention to them as he approached the front desk, speaking to the receptionist in a gruff voice. Jenna's heart pounded as she looked between him and Lucky. Something wasn't right. She had never seen Lucky react to anyone this way before. His fear was different now. Deeper, more instinctual. She bent down, scooping Lucky into her arms. He buried his face against her chest, his small body trembling. "Shh, baby," she whispered, her own stomach twisting with unease. "I've got you." Dr. Miller appeared from the back, his expression lightening when he saw them. "Jenna, right on time. How's our little warrior doing?" Jenna forced a smile, her grip tightening slightly around Lucky. "He's been doing great," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Jenna held Lucky tightly against her chest, her heart pounding as she tried to soothe him. His trembling hadn't stopped, his body pressed firmly against her as if trying to disappear. The way he reacted to that man wasn't normal. Lucky had been cautious before, even wary of strangers at times, but this was different. This was terror. Dr. Miller must have sensed her unease because he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Come on back," he said quietly, motioning toward the exam room. "Let's get Lucky checked out." Jenna nodded, forcing her feet to move. Lucky whimpered softly as she carried him through the hallway, only starting to calm once the door closed behind them. She set him on the exam table, keeping one hand on his back as he took shaky breaths. Dr. Miller watched him for a moment before speaking. "That was quite a reaction," he said carefully. Jenna swallowed hard. "I've never seen him like that," she admitted. "He's been nervous before, but this was different." The second that man walked in, he was terrified, like he knew him. Dr. Miller nodded slowly. "Dogs don't forget trauma," he said. "If someone hurt him before, and he recognized something about that man, his scent, his voice, even the way he moved, it could have triggered something in him." Jenna's stomach twisted. "So you think it's possible that man—" Dr. Miller hesitated. "I can't say for sure, but if Lucky reacted like that, there's a reason. And it's not a good one." Jenna ran her fingers gently over Lucky's fur, feeling his heartbeat slowing under her touch. "I just want him to feel safe," she whispered. Dr. Miller gave her a reassuring nod. "He's come a long way already, and he's still healing, physically and emotionally. But he has you now, and that makes all the difference." Jenna tried to let his words comfort her, but the unease in her chest wouldn't go away. She forced herself to focus as Dr. Miller began his exam, checking Lucky's paws carefully. The bandages had been changed regularly, and the wounds were healing well. His paws were still sensitive, but he was using them more, building strength little by little. The progress was slow, but it was progress. "He's doing well," Dr. Miller said. "Another couple of weeks, and he should be able to walk more comfortably. We'll keep monitoring for any signs of infection, but right now, I'm happy with how he's healing." Jenna managed a small smile. "That's good. Really good." Dr. Miller gave Lucky a final gentle pat before stepping back. "Keep doing what you're doing, and if anything seems off, call me." Jenna nodded, scooping Lucky back into her arms. "Thanks, Doc." As she walked out of the exam room, she instinctively tightened her hold on Lucky, scanning the waiting room for the man from before. He was gone. Relief washed over her, but it didn't last long. The way Lucky had reacted haunted her. She needed to know if this was just coincidence or something more. By the time she got home, Lucky was calmer, curling up on the couch beside her as if he hadn't just had a full-on panic attack. She gently stroked his back, her mind racing. Could she find out who that man was? Would Dr. Miller's receptionist know? Would she even be allowed to say anything? Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was her friend, Rachel. "Hey," Jenna said, trying to push the stress from her voice. "Hey yourself," Rachel said. "How's the little guy doing?" Jenna looked down at Lucky, who was now dozing against her leg. "Better. He's healing well. But something weird happened at the vet today." Rachel's voice shifted. "Weird how?" Jenna hesitated before telling her everything. How Lucky had reacted, the man's presence, the deep-rooted fear that had overtaken the little pup. When she finished, there was silence on the other end. "Jenna," Rachel finally said, her voice serious. "What if that man had something to do with what happened to Lucky?" Jenna let out a slow breath. "That's what I'm afraid of." "You need to be careful," Rachel said. "If Lucky recognized him, and if that guy did hurt him, what if he recognizes Lucky too?" The thought sent a shiver down Jenna's spine. She glanced at her front door, suddenly feeling uneasy. "I don't know what to do." Rachel was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "Maybe you should find out who he is." Jenna bit her lip. "How?" "Call the clinic. See if they'll tell you anything. If they can't, maybe they'll at least confirm if he's been there before. You deserve to know if you need to be on guard." Jenna nodded, even though Rachel couldn't see her. "I'll try." After hanging up, she stared at her phone for a long moment before dialing the vet's office. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Dr. Miller's office? This is Lisa." Jenna took a deep breath. "Hey, Lisa, it's Jenna." "Hi, Jenna. Everything okay with Lucky?" "He's doing great," Jenna said quickly. I have a bit of a weird question." Lisa hesitated. "Okay?" Jenna glanced down at Lucky. "The man who came in earlier. Do you know who he is?" There was a pause. I can't really give out client information." Jenna expected that, but she pressed on. "I get it. I do. But Lucky had a really strong reaction to him. I mean, full-on terror. If that man had anything to do with what happened to him, I just need to know if I should be worried." Lisa was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower. "I can't say much, but you should trust Lucky's instincts." Jenna's grip on the phone tightened. "So he has been here before?" Another pause. Then, softly, "Just be careful, Jenna." The line went dead. Jenna stared at the phone, her heart hammering in her chest. That was all the confirmation she needed. Lucky hadn't just been reacting to a random man. He had been reacting to someone from his past, someone who had hurt him. And now Jenna had no idea if that person had recognized him too. Jenna barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind replayed the way Lucky had reacted to that man at the clinic. The sheer panic in his tiny body. The way he had tried to make himself as small as possible. The way he had trembled against her. She didn't know who the man was or what he had done to Lucky, but she knew one thing for sure. Her dog had recognized him. And now, Jenna couldn't shake the thought that the man might have recognized Lucky too. By the time morning arrived, her exhaustion was outweighed by her determination. She refused to let fear take over. Lucky was hers now, and she would protect him, no matter what it took. She made herself a strong cup of coffee and sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, debating what to do next. She had already pushed Lisa at the clinic for more information, and she doubted she'd get anything else from her. But she still had options. There had to be a way to find out more about the man without stepping over legal lines. Lucky stretched beside her, letting out a soft yawn before nuzzling against her leg. Jenna smiled, running a hand over his fur. "Morning, buddy," she murmured. "You feeling better today?" His tail gave a small wag, and he licked her hand in response. The memory of yesterday's fear was still fresh in her mind, but seeing him like this, safe, comfortable, happy, it reassured her that they were moving in the right direction. He was healing, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. An idea formed in her mind as she took another sip of coffee. Maybe she couldn't get direct answers from the clinic, but there was another way to gather information. If the man had been a client there, he might have a dog of his own. And if he did, there was a chance someone in town had seen him walking his pet or bringing it to the park. People noticed things, especially in smaller communities like theirs. Jenna grabbed Lucky's leash, gently attaching it to his collar. "Come on, bud. We're going on a little adventure." The town's main park was a short drive away, and by mid-morning it was already bustling with people walking their dogs, chatting with friends, and enjoying the fresh air. Jenna parked and carried Lucky out, setting him gently on the grass. His paws were still healing, but he had been doing better every day, and she knew he'd enjoy the outing. She started walking slowly, keeping an eye out for familiar faces. It wasn't long before she spotted Sarah, a fellow dog owner she had met a few weeks ago. Sarah was sitting on a bench, tossing a ball for her golden retriever, Daisy. Jenna approached with a smile. "Hey, Sarah, how's Daisy?" Sarah looked up and grinned. "Jenna, she's doing great, as usual. And look at Lucky. He's looking so much better." She reached down to give him a gentle pat, and Lucky responded with a happy little wag. "How's he been adjusting?" "Really well," Jenna said. "He's a sweetheart. But actually, I was wondering if you could help me with something." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Sure, what's up?" Jenna hesitated, then decided to be as straightforward as possible. "I was at the vet yesterday, and this man came in. Lucky had a really strong reaction to him, like pure terror. I think he might have known him before, and I think that man might have hurt him." Sarah's face grew serious. "Oh no, that's awful." "Yeah," Jenna murmured. "I don't know the guy's name, but he was tall, kind of broad-shouldered, rough-looking. Do you know anyone like that? Someone who might have a dog?" Sarah frowned, thinking. "You know, there is a guy that sounds like that. I've seen him around with this big black dog. Not friendly at all. I think he lives over on Maple Street, but I don't know much else about him." Jenna's pulse quickened. "Maple Street? Are you sure?" Sarah nodded. "Pretty sure. I see him walk that dog late in the evening sometimes. Doesn't talk to anyone, just keeps his head down." Jenna thanked her and stayed at the park a little longer, giving Lucky time to enjoy the fresh air before heading home. She couldn't shake the new information she had gathered. A man on Maple Street with a big black dog. Could that really be the same man from the clinic? And if it was, did that mean Lucky had once belonged to him? That thought made her stomach churn. If Lucky had been his, that meant he had either abandoned him or worse, hurt him intentionally. The idea of confronting this man was terrifying, but Jenna knew she couldn't just ignore what she had learned. She needed to know the truth. That evening, as the sun began to set, Jenna made a decision. She wasn't going to do anything reckless, but she would at least drive down Maple Street, just to see if she could spot the man Sarah had mentioned. She needed to know if her gut feeling was right. She put Lucky in the passenger seat, keeping the windows partially rolled down so he could enjoy the breeze. As she drove slowly through the neighborhood, she scanned the sidewalks, looking for any sign of the man or his dog. Then she saw him. A tall man, broad-shouldered, rough-looking. He was walking a large black dog, just like Sarah had described. His face was partially hidden beneath the brim of a baseball cap, but there was something about his posture, the way he moved, that made Jenna's breath catch in her throat. Beside her, Lucky went rigid. A low, fearful whimper escaped his throat, and he pressed himself against the seat as if trying to disappear. Jenna's hands tightened on the steering wheel. It was him. It had to be. The man didn't seem to notice her as he continued walking, his dog pulling slightly at the leash. Jenna forced herself to stay calm, not wanting to draw attention. She watched him for a moment longer before driving past, her mind racing. She didn't know what to do next. She had found him, but what now? She couldn't just walk up to him and demand answers. If he had hurt Lucky before, he wouldn't hesitate to lie. And even if he did recognize Lucky, he had no legal claim to him. Lucky was hers now. But the fact that this man still lived in town still walked freely after whatever he had done to Lucky. It made her blood boil. She had to be smart about this. She had to figure out a way to make sure he never had the chance to hurt another dog again. As she pulled into her driveway, she looked over at Lucky, who was still curled up against the seat, his small body tense. She reached out, stroking his fur gently. "Don't worry, buddy," she whispered. "I'm going to keep you safe. No matter what." Jenna couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen. She had expected that seeing the man would bring her some clarity, but instead, it left her more unsettled than ever. Lucky's reaction had confirmed her fears. This man was tied to his past, and not in a good way. But what could she do about it? She wasn't a detective. She had no proof of what had happened to Lucky. All she had was the reaction of a terrified puppy and her own gut feeling. That night, as she lay in bed, Lucky curled up beside her. She knew she had to figure out a way to act. The thought of doing nothing made her feel sick. What if this man had hurt other dogs? What if he still had animals suffering under his care? She couldn't let it go. Not now. The next morning, she called Rachel. "I found him," she said as soon as her friend answered. Rachel's breath hitched. "The man from the vet? You're sure?" "Positive," Jenna said. "Lucky recognized him immediately. He froze up just like he did at the clinic. I drove past and it was exactly how Sarah described. Tall guy, broad shoulders, big black dog. He lives on Maple Street." Rachel was silent for a moment. "Jenna, be careful with this. If this guy is dangerous, you don't want to do something that could put you in harm's way." "I know," Jenna admitted, "but I can't let this go. There has to be something I can do. I mean, what if he still has other animals? What if he's still hurting them?" Rachel let out a slow breath. "If you really want to pursue this, you need to do it the right way. You need evidence. You can't just accuse someone without proof." Jenna nodded, even though Rachel couldn't see her. "I know. That's why I need to figure out how to get some." Rachel hesitated. Are you thinking about trying to talk to him?" The idea had crossed Jenna's mind, but the thought of confronting him directly made her uneasy. "No," she said. "Not yet. But I need to find out more about him. Maybe there's something in public records, complaints, citations, anything that might give me a reason to report him." Rachel seemed relieved by that. "That's a good start, but also, maybe talk to Dr. Miller again. If this guy was a client, maybe he's had other pets in the past. If something happened to them, maybe Dr. Miller knows more than he's letting on." Jenna felt a spark of hope. "That's a great idea. I'll stop by the clinic today." After they hung up, Jenna got ready and took Lucky with her. She didn't want to leave him home alone, not with all the thoughts swirling in her mind. If nothing else, she wanted to make sure he felt safe with her, no matter what happened. Dr. Miller looked up in surprise when she walked in. "Jenna? Back so soon? Everything okay?" Jenna glanced around, lowering her voice. "I need to talk to you. In private." His expression turned serious, and he gestured for her to follow him into his office. Once the door was closed, Jenna sat down, Lucky resting in her lap. "I think I found the man from the clinic," she said quietly. Dr. Miller's eyes darkened. "Go on." "I didn't talk to him," she said. "But I found out where he lives, and I saw him walking his dog. Lucky knew him immediately. He was terrified." Dr. Miller exhaled slowly. "That doesn't surprise me." Jenna's heart skipped a beat. "So you do know something?" Dr. Miller hesitated, then leaned forward. "I can't break client confidentiality, Jenna, but I will say this. Lucky's reaction isn't unfounded. I've treated dogs before that, well, Let's just say they didn't seem to be in the best hands. But without proof, my hands are tied. I can report suspected abuse, but if there's no visible evidence, there's only so much that can be done. Jenna gritted her teeth. So he's done this before. Dr. Miller didn't confirm or deny it outright, but the look in his eyes told her enough. If you're serious about this, you need to be smart. If there are other animals in his care, you need to document anything suspicious. Get pictures, videos, anything that can't be ignored. And if you ever see an animal in immediate danger, call animal control. Don't try to handle it yourself. Jenna nodded. I understand. Dr. Miller studied her for a long moment before sighing. Be careful, Jenna. I mean it. People like that, they don't always take kindly to being exposed. Jenna swallowed hard. I will. She left the clinic with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just going to let this go. She was going to find a way to stop this man. But she had to be smart about it. That night, she parked her car a few houses down from Maple Street, keeping the lights off as she watched from a distance. She felt a little ridiculous. She wasn't a detective, and she definitely wasn't a spy, but she needed to know if there were signs of mistreatment. If she could see anything unusual, anything that might give her a reason to call animal control. It wasn't long before she spotted him. The man stepped out of his house, the large black dog by his side. Jenna's stomach twisted when she saw the way he yanked the leash roughly, the dog shrinking back slightly before following him. The man didn't speak to the dog, didn't acknowledge him with any kind of affection. He walked with a stiff, almost impatient stride, like the dog was an obligation rather than a companion. Jenna pulled out her phone, snapping a few pictures from a distance. She needed more than this. But it was a start. If she could catch something more concrete, something that proved he was being cruel or neglectful, she would have a case. As she watched, the man suddenly turned his head. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as she sank lower in her seat. Had he seen her? Her heart pounded as she held her breath, watching him closely. But after a few seconds, he shook his head and kept walking, his dog trailing behind him. Jenna let out a slow breath. She needed to be careful, but she also needed to be persistent. Lucky had been hurt by this man once. She wasn't going to let it happen again. She looked down at Lucky, who was curled up in the passenger seat, fast asleep. She reached over and gently stroked his fur, her determination strengthening. Don't worry, buddy, she whispered. I'll make sure he never hurts you, or any other dog, ever again. Jenna sat in her car for a long time after the man disappeared down the street with his dog. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. She had told herself she would be smart about this, that she wouldn't act impulsively. But now that she had seen him again, seen the way he handled that poor animal, it was getting harder to hold back. Lucky shifted in the passenger seat, letting out a small yawn as he stretched. Jenna glanced over at him, her heart swelling with protectiveness. He was safe now, but there was no telling how many other dogs had suffered under that man's care, or how many still were. She needed a plan. Watching from a distance wasn't going to be enough. She had to find a way to get proof, something undeniable that animal control couldn't ignore. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Rachel's number. Rachel answered on the second ring. Jenna, everything okay? Jenna let out a slow breath. I saw him again. The man from the clinic. I followed up on what Sarah told me, and she was right. He lives on Maple Street. I just watched him take his dog for a walk. Rachel was quiet for a moment before saying, And? And he yanked the leash so hard the dog flinched, Jenna said. I took some pictures, but they don't really show much. I need something stronger. I need proof that he's hurting them. Rachel sighed. Jenna, you need to be careful. If he's the kind of person who hurts animals, he's not the kind of person you want to mess with. I know, Jenna said. I won't do anything reckless, I promise. But I have to do something. I was thinking, what if I talk to his neighbors? See if anyone else has noticed anything. Maybe someone has seen him mistreating his dog before. Rachel hesitated. That's not a bad idea. Just be careful how you approach them. If they know him personally, they might not be willing to talk. I'll be careful, Jenna assured her. I'll keep you updated. After hanging up, Jenna took a deep breath and started her car. She drove slowly down Maple Street again, this time paying more attention to the surrounding houses. Most of them were modest, single-story homes with well-kept lawns. A few had fences with dogs playing in the yards. She parked a couple of houses down from the man's place, watching for any signs of movement. Then she spotted an elderly woman tending to her flower bed in the yard next door. Jenna hesitated for only a moment before stepping out of her car, making sure to keep Lucky close. She approached with a friendly smile, hoping she didn't come across as suspicious. "Excuse me, ma'am?" The woman looked up, brushing soil from her hands. "Oh, hello there. Can I help you?" Jenna nodded. "Sorry to bother you. I was just wondering if you knew the man who lives next door. I think his name is—" She paused, realizing she didn't actually know his name. The woman gave her a wary look. "Why do you ask?" Jenna hesitated before deciding to be honest. "I don't mean to pry, but I'm concerned about his dog. I saw him walking it earlier, and it seemed scared of him. I just wanted to know if you've ever noticed anything." The woman's expression softened. She glanced toward the house next door before lowering her voice. "That poor dog," she murmured. "I've lived here for over 10 years, and I've seen things I don't like. I've heard yelling, barking late at night, distressed barking, not normal barking. I've even seen him shove that dog before." Jenna's stomach twisted. "Has anyone reported him?" The woman let out a sigh. "I have, more than once. But by the time someone comes to check, the dog looks fine, and they always say they need more evidence." Jenna felt a spark of frustration. "So no one's done anything?" "Not for lack of trying," the woman said. "But without solid proof, it's just my word against his. And he's not exactly friendly when confronted." Jenna's mind raced. This was exactly what she feared. Someone who knew how to cover his tracks just enough to avoid consequences. But now she knew she wasn't the only one who had noticed the signs. If she could gather enough evidence, maybe they could finally do something about it. "Would you be willing to make another report?" Jenna asked. "If I can gather more proof, maybe this time they'll listen." The woman studied her for a moment before nodding. "If you can get something concrete, I'll back you up. But be careful, dear. He's not the type you want to make an enemy of." Jenna nodded. "I will, thank you." She walked back to her car, her mind already working through her next steps. If animal control needed more proof, then that's what she would get. She wasn't going to let this man slip through the cracks again. That night, she parked near Maple Street once more, this time prepared to wait as long as she needed. She had her phone ready, camera set to record, hoping to capture any mistreatment. Lucky was curled up beside her, his small breaths steady as he slept. Jenna stroked his fur absent-mindedly, whispering, "I won't let him hurt anyone else." After about an hour, the front door of the man's house opened. Jenna tensed as she saw him step outside, the black dog at his side. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in the dog's body. The man pulled the leash roughly, muttering something under his breath. Jenna started recording, keeping the phone steady as she zoomed in. As they reached the end of the driveway, the dog hesitated. It was subtle, But Jenna noticed. The way its ears flattened, the way it seemed reluctant to move forward. The man yanked hard, jerking the poor animal forward. The dog stumbled but didn't resist, clearly too afraid to fight back. Jenna clenched her jaw. She needed more. She needed something undeniable. But even this short clip was enough to show mistreatment. She kept recording, hoping he would slip up and reveal just how cruel he really was. Then, as if on cue, he suddenly turned and kicked the dog in the side. Jenna sucked in a sharp breath, her entire body going rigid. The dog let out a yelp, cowering as the man yanked the leash again. She felt her blood boil as she held the phone steady, making sure she caught every second of it. This was it. This was what she needed. She stopped the recording, her hands shaking with adrenaline. This was more than enough to report him. She wasn't waiting another day. First thing in the morning, she was going straight to animal control, and this time, they wouldn't be able to ignore it. She looked over at Lucky, sleeping soundly beside her, unaware of what had just happened. Jenna reached over and gently stroked his head, her voice firm as she whispered, "You're safe now, and I'm going to make sure no one else has to go through what you did." Jenna barely slept that night. The image of the man kicking his dog played over and over in her mind, filling her with a sickening mix of anger and urgency. She had proof now. Real, undeniable evidence that he was hurting his dog. There was no way animal control could ignore this. They had to act. She was up before sunrise, her phone in hand as she prepared to make the call. Lucky stretched beside her, letting out a soft yawn before nuzzling against her side. She ran her fingers over his fur, grounding herself for what was ahead. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered. "Animal Control, this is Officer Davis. How can I help you?" Jenna took a deep breath. "Hi, my name is Jenna Wells, and I need to report an animal abuser. I have video evidence." There was a brief pause before Officer Davis's voice sharpened. "Can you describe the situation?" Jenna did, recounting everything, the reports from the neighbor, the way Lucky had reacted to the man, and most importantly, the video she had taken the night before. "Can you send the footage to our office?" Officer Davis asked. "If it clearly shows abuse, we can escalate it immediately." Jenna nodded, even though the officer couldn't see her. "I'll send it right now." She quickly attached the video to an email, her fingers trembling slightly as she hit send. It felt like the most important message she had ever sent. After a few minutes, Officer Davis responded. "I just reviewed the footage," she said. "This is serious. We're going to send an officer to investigate. Can you tell me the address of the suspect?" Jenna gave her the address, gripping her phone tightly. "What happens now?" "There's a process we have to follow," Officer Davis explained. "We'll do a welfare check on the dog and look for any additional signs of neglect or abuse. If we determine the animal is in immediate danger, we have the authority to remove it. If we find evidence of a pattern of abuse, the owner can face criminal charges." Jenna's heart pounded. "How long will it take?" "We're making this a priority," the officer assured her. "We'll have someone there today." Jenna let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you." After hanging up, she sat back, staring at the ceiling. It was happening. Something was finally being done, but she wouldn't feel relief until she knew for sure that the dog was safe. The morning dragged on. She tried to distract herself, cleaning the house, taking Lucky out for a walk, but her mind kept returning to Maple Street. What if the man somehow talked his way out of it? What if they checked and found nothing? She couldn't stand the thought of that dog suffering any longer. By noon, her phone rang again. She snatched it up immediately. Hello? Ms. Wells, this is Officer Davis again. We conducted the welfare check. Jenna held her breath. And? We found signs of physical abuse on the dog, Officer Davis said. Bruising, signs of malnourishment. He was hesitant to approach us at first, but once we got close, it was clear he was fearful of his owner. Jenna felt a wave of relief and fury at the same time. Did you take him? Yes. We seized the animal and transported him to a veterinary clinic for evaluation. The vet is documenting the injuries and will be filing an official report. The owner has been cited for animal cruelty and could face charges. Jenna pressed a hand to her chest, her emotions overwhelming her. So he's safe now? Yes, Officer Davis confirmed. Thanks to your report. Jenna let out a shaky breath. Thank you. Thank you so much. Don't thank me, the officer said. You did the right thing, and because of that, this dog has a second chance. After the call ended, Jenna sat on the couch, staring at Lucky. He was watching her curiously, his head tilted. She reached down and scooped him into her arms, holding him close. You're safe, she murmured. And now he is too. The next few days passed in a blur. Jenna followed the case closely, checking in with Officer Davis for updates. The vet confirmed that the dog had been abused for some time, though thankfully his injuries were treatable. He would need rehabilitation, but he was on the road to recovery. The owner, meanwhile, had been given a court date. Whether he would face jail time was still uncertain, but at the very least, he had lost the right to own animals. It wasn't enough, not really, but it was something. One afternoon, Jenna received an unexpected call. Ms. Wells, a gentle voice said. This is Dr. Barnes, the veterinarian overseeing the dog's care. Jenna's heart skipped a beat. Yes? I just wanted to personally thank you, Dr. Barnes said. This dog has been through a lot, but he's making progress. He's responding well to treatment, and his spirit is coming back. Given everything he's been through, it's remarkable how resilient he is. Jenna swallowed past the lump in her throat. That's amazing to hear. Dr. Barnes hesitated before continuing. We're looking for a foster home, somewhere he can heal outside of the shelter environment. Given your history with Lucky, I was wondering if you'd be interested. Jenna froze. She glanced down at Lucky, who was curled up beside her, completely content. Could she take in another dog? Could she help him the way she had helped Lucky? But deep down, she already knew the answer. Yes, she said, a smile spreading across her face. I'd love to. Jenna spent the next 2 days preparing for the arrival of her new foster dog. The moment she had said yes to Dr. Barnes, a wave of emotions had hit her. Excitement, nervousness, determination. She had taken Lucky in without hesitation, and now she was about to do the same for another dog who had been through just as much, if not more. Lucky watched curiously as she set up a second dog bed near his. She had picked out a few toys, bowls, and a separate feeding station, wanting to make sure the new dog had everything he needed. It wasn't lost on her that she had no idea how he would behave. Would he be aggressive? Skittish? Completely withdrawn? She had seen glimpses of what Lucky had gone through, but this dog had endured even longer under that man's care. His wounds weren't just physical, they were emotional too. The next afternoon, Jenna pulled into the veterinary clinic, her heart pounding. She had spoken with Dr. Barnes earlier that morning, who had assured her that the dog was doing much better but would still need time to adjust. As she stepped inside, Dr. Barnes greeted her with a warm smile. He's ready, she said, leading Jenna toward the back. He's been hesitant around new people, but he's making progress. Just take it slow. Let him come to you. Jenna nodded, feeling Lucky's leash tighten slightly as he sensed her nerves. When they reached the small room, she saw him. The black dog was curled up on a blanket in the corner, his head resting on his front paws. His fur was patchy in places where the vet had treated wounds, and his ribs were still slightly visible. But despite it all, there was something in his eyes that made Jenna's heart ache. A quiet, cautious hope. "Hey, buddy," she said softly, kneeling down a few feet away from him. "You ready to go home?" The dog lifted his head slightly, watching her warily. Jenna stayed still, waiting, letting him make the first move. Lucky sat beside her, his ears perked as he observed the other dog with gentle curiosity. After a long moment, the black dog slowly pushed himself up, taking hesitant steps toward her. Jenna extended her hand, palm up, allowing him to sniff. He paused, then took another step forward, his nose brushing against her fingers. When he didn't pull away, Jenna let her fingers glide over his muzzle, offering the lightest touch of reassurance. Dr. Barnes smiled. "That's a good sign." Jenna swallowed back the lump in her throat. "He's going to be okay." "I think so too." The drive home was quiet. The black dog sat in the back seat, watching the world pass by through the window. Lucky sat beside him, the two dogs occasionally exchanging glances. Jenna glanced in the mirror, smiling at how much progress had already been made. When they arrived, she led them inside, keeping a close eye on both dogs. Lucky walked over to his bed and flopped down, stretching out comfortably. The black dog hesitated at the doorway, his body tense as he took in his new surroundings. "It's okay," Jenna murmured, setting a water bowl down nearby. "This is your home, now." He stepped forward cautiously, his movements slow and deliberate. He sniffed the air, the floor, the furniture. Everything was new to him. Everything was unfamiliar. But he didn't cower. He didn't flinch. He simply observed, taking it all in at his own pace. Jenna settled onto the couch, watching him explore. She knew this wouldn't be easy. Healing wasn't linear. There would be setbacks, bad days, moments where progress seemed impossible. But she had seen what love and patience had done for Lucky. She had seen how a dog who had once been too scared to even move had learned to trust again. And now, she was ready to do it all over again. "You're safe here," she whispered. "I promise." The first few nights with the new dog were challenging. Jenna had expected that. He wasn't used to kindness, wasn't used to soft voices or gentle hands. He flinched at sudden noises and avoided eye contact when she spoke to him. It reminded her of Lucky's first days, the way fear had been embedded in every movement. But there was something different about this dog. His fear wasn't just from pain, it was from years of conditioning, from being ignored, from learning that humans weren't to be trusted. She didn't rush him. She let him adjust at his own pace, offering space when he needed it and presence when he sought it. He ate his meals cautiously, always glancing up as if expecting someone to take it away. She never rushed him, never pushed him. She sat nearby, letting him see that she wasn't a threat. Slowly, he started to relax, though his body remained tense, even in rest. Lucky seemed to understand in a way Jenna couldn't fully grasp. He didn't try to play or invade the other dog's space. He simply existed beside him, showing him that this home was safe. At night, when the new dog refused to sleep in the bed Jenna had set up for him, Lucky curled up on the floor near him, a silent reassurance that he wasn't alone. On the third morning, Jenna woke up to something unexpected. She had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from keeping an ear out for any signs of distress. When she opened her eyes, Lucky was curled up in his usual spot, but beside him, stretched out hesitantly on the rug, was the black dog. He wasn't curled up tight like before, his body rigid with tension. Instead, he was lying in a way that suggested a sliver of trust, of comfort. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Jenna didn't move, not wanting to startle him. Instead, she reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against the rug. "Morning, buddy," she whispered. The black dog lifted his head slightly, blinking at her before resting his chin back down. It wasn't full trust, but it wasn't fear either. Jenna felt her heart swell. She continued her routine, keeping things predictable and safe. She took Lucky out first, giving the new dog time to watch from the doorway. She left the leash near him, not forcing anything, just letting him decide. On the 5th day, he took a hesitant step forward. On the 6th, he let her clip the leash on without cowering. By the end of the week, he walked outside with her, his steps slow but steady. Neighbors noticed the new addition. Some asked about him, and Jenna gave simple answers. He needed a safe place, she would say. Most people nodded in understanding. They had seen Lucky's transformation. They knew Jenna wouldn't turn away from a dog in need. Rachel stopped by one evening, kneeling near the dog's resting spot. "Have you thought of a name for him yet?" she asked. Jenna had. She had been thinking about it since the moment she brought him home. "Shadow," she said softly. "Because he's learning how to step out of one." Rachel smiled. "That's perfect." The days turned into weeks. Shadow still had moments where fear won out, where he flinched at sounds or hesitated before stepping into a room. But there were victories, too. He started eating his food without constantly looking over his shoulder. He began lying down in places other than corners. He even wagged his tail once. Just a small movement, barely noticeable, but Jenna had seen it. One evening, Jenna sat on the floor beside him, her back resting against the couch. Lucky had fallen asleep near the fireplace, his breathing slow and steady. Shadow was awake, watching her, his dark eyes full of something she couldn't quite place yet. "You're safe here," she told him, just as she had told Lucky all those weeks ago. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." Shadow blinked, his ears twitching slightly. Then slowly, he stretched out, resting his head on the floor. He let out a quiet sigh, the kind that spoke of exhaustion, but also of relief. Jenna smiled, reaching out just enough to let her fingers graze his paw. He didn't pull away. It wasn't everything, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. Jenna settled into a new routine with Shadow. Each day brought tiny changes, subtle but significant steps forward. He no longer flinched when she reached for his food bowl. He let her leash him up without hesitation. He still preferred to sleep near the door, but at least now he lay stretched out instead of curled into himself like he was bracing for something bad to happen. Lucky continued to be a steadying presence. When they went for walks, Shadow stayed close to Lucky's side, as if taking cues from him on how to act. If Lucky stopped to sniff a bush, Shadow did too. If Lucky wagged his tail at a passing neighbor, Shadow hesitated but eventually mimicked the motion, just a small flick at the tip. It was progress, slow but undeniable. One afternoon, Jenna took both dogs to the park. It was quiet, just a few people walking along the paved trails. She sat on a bench, watching as Lucky trotted around happily, while Shadow stayed closer to her feet. His ears twitched at every sound, but he wasn't panicking. That alone felt like a victory. A woman with a golden retriever approached, smiling warmly. "Is this the new one?" she asked, nodding at Shadow. Jenna nodded. "Yeah, his name's Shadow." The woman knelt down, letting her retriever sniff toward Shadow, who stiffened but didn't retreat. "You're doing good work," she said. "He's still unsure, but there's a difference in his eyes." Jenna glanced down and saw what the woman meant. There was still wariness, but there was also curiosity. A few weeks ago, he would have backed away entirely. Now he was standing his ground, watching, trying to understand instead of simply reacting. They stayed at the park for a while longer, letting Lucky roam and Shadow absorb the world at his own pace. When they got home, Jenna took off their leashes, expecting Shadow to retreat to his usual resting spot. But instead, he hesitated in the middle of the living room, looking around as if considering something. Then, to Jenna's surprise, he walked over to Lucky's bed and lay down beside him. Jenna sucked in a breath. It was the first time Shadow had chosen to rest somewhere other than the doorway. Lucky stirred slightly, lifting his head to glance at Shadow before letting out a soft sigh and closing his eyes again. Jenna let them be, not wanting to disturb the moment. It was these little things, these quiet changes, that told her Shadow was starting to believe he was safe. Over the next few weeks, Shadow continued to open up. He still had his moments. Loud noises made him jump, and sudden movements put him on edge. But he had started coming to Jenna on his own. Sometimes when she sat on the couch, he would walk over and rest his head on her knee. The first time it happened, she barely breathed, afraid that moving too quickly would scare him off. When he stayed there, accepting her gentle touch, she knew they had turned a corner. Rachel visited one evening, watching as Shadow sat near Jenna's feet, while Lucky sprawled out on the rug. "You've worked magic on him," she said, shaking her head. Jenna smiled. "Not magic, just patience." Rachel reached down, holding out her hand for Shadow to sniff. He hesitated, but eventually leaned forward. "Have you thought about what comes next? Are you still just fostering?" Jenna had been thinking about that a lot. At first, she told herself she was just a temporary home, that Shadow would eventually go to a permanent family. But now, she wasn't so sure. "I don't know if I can let him go," she admitted quietly. Rachel grinned. "I had a feeling you'd say that." Jenna glanced down at Shadow, running her fingers gently along his back. He looked up at her, his dark eyes filled with something softer than before. "Trust." Jenna smiled. "I think he's already home." Jenna made the adoption official a week later. The moment she signed the papers, relief washed over her. Shadow wasn't just a foster anymore. He was family. He belonged here, with her and Lucky, in a home where he would never know fear again. She had promised him safety, and now that promise was permanent. Shadow's progress continued in small but meaningful ways. He started wagging his tail more freely. He followed Jenna from room to room, his presence quiet but constant. He learned that belly rubs were not something to fear, but something to enjoy. When he flopped over onto his back for the first time, Jenna nearly cried. It was a level of trust she hadn't expected so soon, but it told her everything she needed to know. He believed her now. He knew she wasn't going to hurt him. Lucky remained his guide, showing him the world through a lens of safety. If Lucky greeted a stranger, Shadow followed. If Lucky chased after a stick, Shadow watched before hesitantly joining in. Their bond was steady, an unspoken understanding that comforted them both. They had been broken before, but together, they were whole. Jenna took them on longer walks, letting them experience new places, new smells, new people. Shadow still had his cautious moments, But his hesitation didn't last as long as it used to. He was learning, growing, finding confidence in ways that once seemed impossible. One evening, Jenna sat on the porch, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. Lucky and Shadow lay side by side at her feet, their bodies relaxed. The sound of crickets filled the air, a quiet symphony of peace. She reached down, running a hand over each of them, feeling the warmth of their fur beneath her fingers. She thought about the day she had found Lucky, bleeding and broken on the road. She thought about the moment she had seen Shadow cowering in the vet's office, too afraid to trust anyone. Now they were here, safe and loved. Shadow lifted his head and pressed his nose against her palm. It was a simple gesture, but it carried so much weight. Gratitude, trust, love. Jenna smiled. "You're home, Shadow, for good." His tail wagged gently, and for the first time he leaned into her touch completely. No hesitation, no fear. They had come so far, and they still had a lifetime ahead of them. Together. In the days that followed, Shadow's transformation became even more evident. Jenna took him and Lucky on a weekend trip to a nearby lake, a place she had often visited in her childhood. The water sparkled under the afternoon sun, and Lucky eagerly dashed toward the shore, splashing into the cool waves. Shadow, however, stood back, watching with careful curiosity. Jenna knelt beside him, running a hand along his back. "It's okay," she murmured. "You don't have to rush." For a long moment, Shadow simply observed. Then, with tentative steps, he waded into the shallows, his paws sinking into the wet sand. He flinched slightly as the water lapped at his legs but didn't retreat. Instead, he took another step, then another, until he was standing beside Lucky, letting the gentle ripples wash over him. Jenna felt her heart swell. It was a small moment, but it held so much meaning. Shadow was allowing himself to experience something new, something unknown, without fear holding him back. Later that evening, they sat around a small campfire, the sky above them dotted with stars. Lucky was already curled up on Jenna's blanket, his breathing deep and even. Shadow, however, was still awake, his gaze focused on the flickering flames. Jenna reached for him, running her fingers through his fur. "You did good today, Shadow. You're brave." He leaned into her touch, his body warm against her side. For so long, he had been afraid to trust, afraid to let himself be vulnerable. But now, here he was, sitting beside her under the stars, completely at ease. Jenna exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle deep in her chest. She had saved him, just as she had saved Lucky. But in truth, they had saved her too. They had taught her patience, resilience, the power of quiet victories. And as she sat there, surrounded by the two souls she had fought so hard for, she knew with certainty that she would do it all over again. They returned home the next day, tired but content. Shadow walked through the front door with ease, no longer hesitating as he once had. He moved through the house with confidence, no longer afraid of his surroundings. It was his home now. He knew that. And so did Jenna. That evening, Rachel stopped by, immediately noticing the change in Shadow. "He looks different," she remarked, "like he finally knows he belongs." Jenna smiled, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "Because he does." Rachel settled onto the couch, watching as Lucky and Shadow lay side by side on the rug. "So, what's next? Are you thinking about fostering again?" Jenna considered the question. She had never planned on taking in a second dog, Yet Shadow had become part of her world so effortlessly. Could she do it again? Could she help another lost soul find their way home? She looked down at her 2 dogs, both of whom had once been abandoned, broken, afraid. Now they were whole. Now they were loved. Jenna smiled. Maybe. But for now, I just want to enjoy this. I want to let this sink in. Rachel nodded. That's fair, but I have a feeling this won't be your last rescue. Jenna laughed, knowing deep down that Rachel was probably right. As the night stretched on, she sat on the floor with her dogs, feeling the quiet comfort of their presence. She thought of all the steps that had led to this moment, of the hardships they had faced and overcome. And she knew, without a doubt, that this was exactly where she was meant to be. No more fear, no more pain, only love, safety, and the promise of better days ahead. Together, forever.